Gus Lindquist, 68 years old, and the morning after we put my wife in the ground, my son-in-law asked me for the password to my bank account. Not the house, not how I was holding up. The password. He said it gentle, the way you'd ask a child to hand over something sharp. And I just stood there in my own kitchen, holding a coffee mug Eleanor had bought me 20 years ago at a flea market in Duluth, and I said I'd think about it. That night, I drove to the storage unit she'd been paying for in cash since 2019, the one I never knew existed, and I sat in the dark looking at 4 file boxes with my name written on them in her handwriting, and I understood for the first time that the woman I'd been married to for 41 years had been 3 moves ahead of all of us the whole time. Before I get into it, if you're watching this from somewhere, drop your town in the comments. I want to know where you are. And if you've ever had somebody decide they knew your life better than you did, hit that subscribe button. You'll want to be here for how this ends. We lived in Cedar Falls, Iowa, in a brick house on Sycamore that I bought in 1981 for $41,000, which everyone thought was insane money at the time. I drove a route for UPS for 31 years and then ran the hub another 9 before they made me take the pension. Eleanor taught 4th grade at Lincoln Elementary until her knees gave out. We were not rich people. We were the kind of people who clipped coupons and reused aluminum foil and put $6 a week into a Christmas Club account at the credit union like our parents taught us. That's the part my daughter and her husband never bothered to understand. They saw a paid-off house and a quiet old man and they did arithmetic. My daughter's named Bryn. She's 39, married to a man named Royce, who sells commercial insurance and wears a watch that he mentions the cost of without you ever asking. They have one boy, my grandson, a 16-year-old named Teddy who plays bass guitar and barely speaks above a mumble and is, near as I can tell, the only honest person left in that household. Bryn wasn't always like this. I want to say that plain because it matters. There was a girl who used to ride on the front of my hand truck down the driveway shrieking with joy. There was a girl who cried at her mother's bedside 3 weeks before the end and held her hand and meant it. Whatever happened to her happened slow the way rust happens, and I didn't see it until it had eaten clean through. Eleanor had pancreatic cancer. If you've watched somebody go through that, you don't need me to describe it. If you haven't, I'll spare you. 11 months from the day they found it. The whole time, Bryn and Royce were what I'd call attentive in a way that always seemed to have a clipboard behind it. Royce kept asking, in this concerned voice, whether we'd gotten our affairs in order. He used that phrase like it was a casserole he was bringing over. Eleanor would smile at him from the recliner and say, "We're handling it, Royce." And then after he left, she'd look at me and roll her eyes the way she had since 1979, and I'd laugh, and I had no idea what she meant by handling it. I thought she meant the will. I thought she meant the funeral plot. I am telling you, I had no idea. The funeral was on a Tuesday. We did it at Grace Lutheran, the church she dragged me to for 4 decades while I pretended I was only there for the coffee hour. Half the town came. My old Rue customers came, people I hadn't seen in 15 years. An old woman named Mrs. Petrakis, who I used to carry her groceries up the steps for. She came on a walker and held my face in both her hands and cried. And the whole time Bryn sat in the front pew with her phone face down on her thigh, and I watched her flip it over to check it twice during the eulogy. Twice, her own mother's eulogy. Royce had his arm around her shoulders, and his eyes were doing the math the entire service. I could see it, the brick house, the lot it sat on, the equity. He had a builder's eye and a vulture's heart, and I didn't have the language for it yet, so I just sat there and let the pastor talk about a woman none of them really knew. The reception was at our house. People brought food. Somebody brought ham, which is the law in the Midwest. You cannot bury a person without a ham appearing. And around 4 o'clock, when the last of the church ladies had gone home, Bryn and Royce stayed behind to help clean up, and that's when it started. Royce sat down at Eleanor's kitchen table, in her chair, the one with the cushion she'd made herself, and he spread out a folder, an actual folder. He brought it to the funeral reception. He had printouts, comparable home sales on Sycamore, a market analysis, a glossy brochure for a place called Prairie Meadows Senior Living over in Waterloo, all soft focus, photographs of silver-haired couples doing watercolors. Bryn stood behind him with her arms crossed, and she said, "Dad, we need to talk about what's next." "What's next?" Her mother had been in the ground for 6 hours. I sat down across from him because my legs had gone strange. Royce leaned forward and folded his hands and said, "Gus, this house is too much for one person. The stairs alone, you're not getting any younger, and frankly, with Eleanor's medical bills." And he let it hang there, the medical bills, like a wet sheet over a line. He assumed there were debts. He assumed cancer had cleaned us out, the way it cleans most people out, and that I was a desperate old man sitting on the only asset he had left. "What about the medical bills?" I said, and Bryn jumped in too fast. "Dad, it's okay. We know it's a lot." Royce ran the numbers. "If we sell the house now, in this market, you clear enough to buy into Prairie Meadows, and there's even a little left over. We'd handle everything. You wouldn't have to lift a finger. As if I'd spent my whole life waiting for the day somebody would relieve me of the burden of my own hands." I looked at the brochure. I looked at the chair he was sitting in. I looked at my grandson, Teddy, who had drifted into the doorway with a paper plate of funeral food and was standing very still watching, the way kids watch when they understand something the adults think is going over their heads. And I said the only thing I could think to say, which was, "I'll think about it." Royce smiled. He thought he'd won. People who smile like that always think the quiet means they've won. That's when I drove to the storage unit. I have to back up a little. About 2 years before she died, Eleanor started getting cagey about the mail. Now we'd had the same routine for 40 years. Mail came, I brought it in, we sat at the table and went through it. But sometime in 2019, she started getting to the box first. Started keeping a little zippered pouch in her purse I never thought twice about. One time, I asked her about a letter from a bank in Cedar Rapids we didn't use, and she said, "Oh, that's just some junk thing those banks send everybody offers." And I believed her because, why on earth wouldn't I? You spend 41 years with somebody, you don't audit them. That's not a marriage. That's an accounting firm. So when the lawyer called me 3 days after the funeral, I almost didn't take it. His name was on a card I'd found taped inside the lid of the first file box, with a sticky note in Eleanor's hand that just said, "Call him, trust him, love you, Ellie." His office was above a hardware store downtown. He was a careful, soft-spoken man about my age, and when I sat down across from him, he slid a single sheet of paper toward me and said, "Mr. Lindquist, your wife has been a client of mine since the spring of 2018. I'm very sorry for your loss. She was one of the sharpest people I ever worked with." What Eleanor had done over 6 years quietly was this. She had a teacher's pension I knew about, modest. What I did not know about was that her Aunt Marjorie, the one who died in 2017 out in Scottsdale, the one we all assumed left everything to the cats, had actually left Eleanor $190,000. Eleanor never told me. She told me Marjorie left her some odds and ends, and she had taken that money and she had not spent it on a single thing for herself. No new car. She drove that rattling Buick until the week she went into hospice. What she did instead was buy outright with cash a small 2-bedroom lake cottage up at Clear Lake, 3 hours north, and put it in a trust. And the rest she invested, carefully, in the boring way, index funds, and reinvested the dividends. And by the time she died, that account was worth a little over $410,000. And every penny of it, the cottage and the cash, was in a trust. My name on it, mine alone, not Brennan's, not as some inheritance to be split. Mine, with a letter of instruction the lawyer handed me in a sealed envelope that I did not open in his office because I knew I wouldn't make it through. The medical bills Royce had been salivating over? Paid. All of them. Eleanor had paid them off in the last 2 months of her life, from an account I didn't know existed, so that nobody, she wrote, could ever use them as a leash on you. I want you to understand what I felt sitting in that office. It wasn't joy. I'd have given every dollar of it, in the cottage and the brick house and my own 2 legs, to have her back at the kitchen table rolling her eyes at Royce. What I felt was something closer to being seen. This woman had spent the last years of her life, while she was dying, while she was scared, building a wall around me that I didn't even know I was standing behind. She knew exactly how this would go. She'd watched Royce too. She'd done the arithmetic on the arithmetic. I drove home, and I sat in the driveway for a long time before I went in. Now here's where most people would expect me to come out swinging. Call Bryn, Throw the brochure in the trash. Tell Royce to get out of my wife's chair. I'll be honest, I wanted to. I'm not a saint, but I sat in that driveway and I thought about something Eleanor wrote in that letter, which I had finally opened at a stoplight on Highway 18 and had to pull over to read. She wrote, "Don't fight them, Gus. You'll lose, even if you win. Let them show you who they are. Then decide." So I didn't fight them. I did something worse for them. I let them keep going. I told Bryn I needed a few weeks to wrap my head around it. She took that as a yes. Within 10 days, Royce had a realtor named at the house taking photographs. He had the gall to start staging it, moving Eleanor's things into boxes, and I let him, because I was watching now, and you learn an enormous amount about a person by watching what they do when they think you've already surrendered. I watched Royce take down the framed cross-stitch Eleanor's grandmother made in 1948 and set it in a box marked "Donate." I watched Brennan go through her mother's jewelry box at the dining room table, holding pieces up to the light, and I heard her say to Royce, "This is probably worth something, right?" about a thin gold chain her mother had worn every single day of her adult life. Not, "Is this the one Grandma gave her?" Not, "Should we keep this for Teddy's wife someday?" "Is this worth something?" And I watched my grandson. Teddy came over more than usual those weeks, and at first I thought his parents had sent him to soften me up, but it wasn't that. The boy would just appear with his backpack, and he'd sit in the garage with me while I pretended to organize tools, and one evening he said, not looking at me, "Grandpa, are you okay?" Like, actually. And I said I was working on it, and he said, "I don't think Mom and Dad are doing this right." 16 years old. He saw it clearer than any of them. I asked him one night what he wanted to do after high school. He went quiet, and then he said he'd been thinking about being a luthier. I didn't even know the word. He had to explain it. Somebody who builds and repairs instruments. He'd been watching videos, teaching himself to set up his own bass. And then he said, fast, like he was ashamed of it, "But Dad says that's not a real job. He wants me to do business at Iowa State." And the way he said it, like a kid apologizing for the shape of his own heart, that's the moment I made up my mind about how this was going to end. The offer on the house came in at the end of the month. A good offer? Over asking? Royce called me, practically vibrating with it. He said, "Gus, this is fantastic. We should accept. I'll have the paperwork drawn up. And listen, I've already talked to the people at Prairie Meadows. They have a unit opening up. We just need a deposit to hold it." A deposit. He wanted me to write a check to hold the cell he was putting me in. I said, "Why don't you and Bryn come over Sunday? Bring Teddy. Let's all sit down." He thought it was a surrender. I could hear it in his voice. Sunday it was. That Sunday I did something I hadn't done in years. I cooked. Eleanor was always the cook, but I made her pot roast the way she made it, from the index card in her recipe box, and I set the table with the good plates, and when they came in, Bryn actually teared up a little and said, "Oh, Dad, this is so nice." And I think for about 90 seconds she remembered she had a father. Roy sat down in Eleanor's chair again. He always sat in Eleanor's chair. I'd noticed that, and I never said a word about it, but I noticed we ate was a decent pot roast. Teddy had 2 helpings. And when the plates were mostly empty, Royce wiped his mouth and got that business-like brightness in his face and said, "So, Gus, should we talk about the timeline?" And I said, "Sure, let's talk about the timeline." And I reached down beside my chair and I brought up a folder of my own. I'd been waiting to use that word back at him. A folder. I slid the first paper across the table. It was a copy of the deed to the brick house. "First thing you should know," I said, "is that the house isn't for sale. I've taken it off the market. I called the realtor Friday." Royce's face did something complicated. "Gus, we have an offer." "Had," I said. "Second thing." I slid the next page across. It was a letter from the lawyer above the hardware store. "I've already moved out, actually. Most of what matters to me has been at the new place for 2 weeks now." Bryn said, "What new place?" I told them about the cottage at Clear Lake. I watched it land. I watched Bryn try to fit it into the picture she had of me, the helpless old man, and fail. And then Royce, because he could not help himself, because the arithmetic was so deep in him it came out reflexively, said, "How are you affording a second property?" That was the question. That was the whole man, in one question. Not when did Mom buy a cottage? Not why didn't she tell us? How are you affording it? The money was the only thing real to him. So I told him. I told him about Aunt Marjorie. I told him about the trust. I watched Bryn's mouth open, and I slid the last paper across the table, and it was a statement from the brokerage, and Royce's eyes went straight to the bottom line number, the way a compass goes north. 410,000 and change, and I will remember the look on his face until the day I die. It was hunger, pure, undisguised. For just a second before he caught himself, he looked at me like I was a safe. "Dad," Bryn said, and her voice had changed, gone soft and warm in a way it hadn't been in months. "Dad, that's wonderful. That's such a relief. We were so worried about you." "Were you?" I said. The kitchen got very quiet. I didn't yell. I want that on the record, because the version of me from 20 years ago would have yelled. I just talked. I said, "You went through your mother's jewelry box looking for what was worth something. You put her grandmother's cross-stitch in a donate box. You sat in her chair, Royce, every single time in her chair. While you tried to sell the house she planted that garden in. Your mother watched you do all of it, Bryn. Not in person, but she saw it coming from 2 years out. She built all of this." I tapped the folder. "So that you couldn't touch me. So that I'd be free of you if it came to that. And it came to that." Bryn started to cry. "And here's the thing I have to be honest about, because this isn't a movie. Some of it was real. I think some of those tears were the girl on the hand truck, finally surfacing, finally understanding what she'd let herself become. But I'd been watching for a month, and I knew the difference now, and I could see that some of it was the $410,000 sliding out of reach. Both things were true at the same time. That's the part nobody tells you about your own children. Both things can be true. Royce, give him credit, dropped the warmth entirely. Gus, you can't just at your age. The tax implications alone, you need help managing." "I have help," I said. "I have a lawyer and a financial advisor and 41 years of watching the smartest woman in the state of Iowa manage money. I'll be fine." And then I turned to my grandson, who had been sitting through all of this stone, still with his eyes down, and I said, "Teddy, come here a second." I handed him an envelope. Inside was a check and a printout of a luthier school in Phoenix, a real one, a year-long program, the best in the country, and I'd already called them. "Your grandmother set aside money for your education," I said, which was true. She had. There was a line in the letter about it. "Not the kind your dad has in mind. The kind that's actually yours. If you want to build instruments, you go build instruments. This is paid. Nobody at this table can touch it. It's in a trust with your name on it. Just yours." Teddy looked at the envelope. Then he looked at his father. Then he looked at me, and his chin started to go, and this big, quiet 16-year-old who hadn't said 3 sentences all dinner stood up and hugged me so hard he knocked the wind out of me, and into my shoulder he said, "Thank you, Grandpa." And I felt his whole body shaking. Royce said, "Now wait a minute." And Teddy turned around, still holding the envelope, and said to his father in a voice I'd never heard him use, clear and steady and done, "No, you don't get to wait a minute. That was a year ago. I'm telling you this from the porch of the cottage at Clear Lake. It's October. The water's gone that hard gray. It gets before winter, and the maples on the far shore are the color of a struck match. I kept the brick house in Cedar Falls, too. I rent the upstairs to a young teacher at Lincoln, a woman just starting out, the way Eleanor started out, and I charge her almost nothing, which would have made Eleanor furious in the good way. I split my time. Summers at the lake, winters in town near the doctor's. I'm not lonely, exactly. I'm not going to lie and say I'm not lonely at all. There's a particular silence at 6 in the evening that used to be the sound of her starting dinner, and now it's just a refrigerator, but it's a clean silence. Nobody's circling it. Bryn and I aren't where we were. We're somewhere new, and it's fragile, and I don't know yet if it'll hold. She left Royce in the spring. I didn't have a thing to do with that, and I want to be clear, I didn't gloat, but I won't pretend I was sorry. She called me a few weeks after she moved out, and she didn't ask for anything. That's how I knew it was real. She just said, "Dad, I think I forgot who I was for a while," and we both cried on the phone like a couple of fools. She comes up to the lake now. She doesn't sit in her mother's chair. She knows better. We're learning each other again from the studs out. It's slow. Rust takes a long time to come off, longer than it takes to set in. Teddy's in Phoenix. He sends me pictures of guitars he's building, the wood grain on them like something out of a church. He calls every Sunday. He's happy. You can hear it. There's no apology in his voice anymore about who he is, and if I never did another worthwhile thing in my life, I'd take that. People ask me sometimes if I'm angry at Eleanor for keeping such a big secret for so long. 41 years of marriage, and she had a whole architecture of money I never knew. And the honest answer is no. Not for 1 second. Because she didn't do it to deceive me. She did it because she knew me, knew I'd have told Bryn out of guilt, knew I'd have softened, knew I'd have written that deposit check to Prairie Meadows just to stop the discomfort, because keeping the peace was always my weakness, and she loved me for it and protected me from it at the same time. That's not a secret. That's the deepest kind of knowing there is. The last thing in her letter, the part I read over and over, said this. She said the money was never the point. The money was just the tool. She said the real inheritance was finding out, while I still had time to do something about it, exactly how much I was worth to the people who said they loved me, and exactly how little that worth had to do with what was in my accounts. So that's the question I'll leave you with, sitting here watching the light go off the water. The people in your life. Ask yourself honestly, are they loving who you are, or are they loving what you've got? Because there's a difference, and most of us don't find out which it is until it's almost too late to matter. Eleanor made sure it wasn't too late for me. If this got to you, if you've got a Royce in your life, or you used to be one, and you're trying not to be anymore, leave me a comment and tell me, and subscribe because I've got more of these. And the next one's about my brother and a piece of land our father left, and you are not going to believe what he tried to pull. The sun's almost down now. I'm going to go inside and make myself some of that pot roast. I've gotten pretty good at it. I've thought a lot about why it ended the way it did. Sitting out here where the lake goes quiet in the evening, none of it was luck. Royce reached for the house because he'd spent years measuring people by what they owned, and a man who only sees price tags will eventually try to put one on you. Bryn drifted into it slow the way I told you, because somewhere along the line she stopped asking who her father was and started asking what her father had. Cause and effect. You treat the people who raised you like an asset to be liquidated, and one day you find out they planned for exactly that, and the door closes. That's not revenge. That's just arithmetic, catching up with character. What saved me wasn't the money. Eleanor's $410,000 and that little cottage were only tools, like she wrote in the letter. What actually carried me through was 3 things I had to dig up in myself when it counted, and I'd ask you to dig them up in yourself too, because you'll need all 3. The first is a plain sense of right and wrong that doesn't bend when somebody offers you comfort to look away. I could have signed Royce's papers. It would have been easier. Keeping the peace was always my weakness, and Eleanor knew it. But there's a difference between peace and surrender, and you have to be honest enough to feel it in your gut when somebody is dressing up a theft as concern. Teach yourself to feel that difference. It'll keep you out of more trouble than any lawyer. The second is the patience to watch and think before you act. My first instinct was to throw that brochure across the room. If I had, I'd have looked like the bitter old man they already believed I was, and I'd have learned nothing. Instead, I waited. I watched what Royce did when he thought he'd won, and what he did told me everything I needed to know. Slowing down long enough to see clearly is its own kind of strength. Most people lose because they react. I won because I observed. And the third is the backbone to follow through once you do see clearly. Knowing the truth is easy. Sitting across the table from your own daughter and saying the hard thing without yelling, that takes something. It would have been simpler to forgive everything and write the check just to make the discomfort stop. I didn't. I held the line, and holding the line is the only thing that ever taught Brennan she'd crossed it. So when you look at the people in your life, ask yourself honestly whether they love who you are or what you've got. And when the answer scares you, don't go soft. Stand on what's right, look before you leap, and have the nerve to act on what you find. Eleanor gave me the means. The rest I had to find for myself, and so will you.